My name is Caitlin McConnell, and I'm here today with Abby Burnett, a well known researcher and expert on death and burial traditions in the Ozarks. The date is December 13th, 2023, and we are at Abby's home near Kingston, Arkansas. This oral history is part of a collaboration between Ozarks Alive and Missouri State University Libraries. Thank you so much for being willing to share with us
You're
today,
so
Abby.
welcome.
I know we're going to cover kind of a wide variety of different topics. Just to kind of get started, can you kind of share a little bit about your background and how you came to Arkansas and got interested in death and burial traditions to begin with?
Well, I think I've always been interested in death and burial, in that I was kind of a Wednesday Addams of a child. I actually grew up with Addams Family cartoons and all of that. I came to Arkansas in 1980. My mother in law died unexpectedly. My husband and I came to Gravette to settle the estate. We left Arkansas. We ended up coming back to the Ozarks almost in a kind of a fluke. We found this piece of property, fell in love with it, took a while to get here. But I've been here for 37 years and worked as a reporter, as a freelance reporter. And because that job sent me out to talk to so many interesting people and to see parts of more or less Newton County, Carroll County, Boone, Madison was my territory. But I more and more fell in love with the Ozarks. I've always been interested in cemeteries. My grandfather in Illinois was a cemetery sexton and would tell me stories, family stories about burials, some very gothic tales, and allowed me to read his cemetery records. He had books going back to the 1800s, so I could find a tombstone, see something that interested me, go back to his house and look up how the person died. And it was fast. I was a preteen and summer vacations with my grandparents. So that planted that love. When I came to Arkansas, I did a project for Shiloh Museum. They wanted to go out and document rural churches. And so they would give me a map and some film, and I would go out and find the churches marked on this map, and I would leave a questionnaire and say, do you have records? Do you have church history? You contact us. But most churches, lots of churches, have cemeteries. And so while I didn't have a lot of time during the project, I vowed to go back. I would see interesting things. And when the project finished and I had free time, I started systematically going back to these cemeteries I had seen. I didn't know what I was seeing in the beginning. We have some very unusual things in the Ozarks. Coffin-shaped forms above ground called false crypts. There's no bodies in them, but big coffins above ground, torso-shaped stones, little grave houses, unusual symbols, unusual epitaphs. And the more time I spent, the more obsessed I became with wanting to know more. I joined the Association for Gravestone Studies, which is based in New England but has conferences all over the country. I just got more and more involved. I started writing. I started researching. And really, the book, Gone to the Grave, which is about Ozark burial, has 2 chapters on cemeteries, and I would have done more if I could have. But as a reporter, here and there, I had run into some interesting stories, and I sort of began wanting to do more research. A newspaper does not allow you to do massive amounts of research. So here and there, I had a few ideas. Decoration Day, for example. People had talked to me about it. I think I'd written about it, but I wanted to know more. So Decoration Day was just one piece of the puzzle. I had seen, I think maybe it was in Eureka Springs, I'd seen a picture of a store that said undertaking and embalming painted on the side. Um, Saw some early pictures of graveyard of funerals. I wrote a book on the Presbyterians in Kingston, and as part of that process, I came across a photo, which ended up being the photo of my book's cover, of a Kingston funeral, a coffin set between 2 chairs, a woman grieving, a church in the background. And all these little pieces were things I wanted to somehow use later. And I really can't say specifically, other than I had 2 friends that said, you should write a book about death. And that also planted a thought. And ultimately, I was doing a book on every facet of death and dying, because as I would research one thing, it would lead to something else. And I was just in love with that subject.
Mm. You know, as I think about the concepts of death, dying, cemeteries, it kind of, to me, and it seems like there's sort of at least 2 categories. You have everything that happens up to when someone's buried, between when they die and when they're buried. But then the lasting impact through the cemetery. And that's kind of a separate thing almost in my mind. They all tie together, but maybe they don't, maybe they're all part of the same continuum. But in my mind, it's like there's this period that especially is full of symbolism and superstition and all sorts of things that were really important in the moment when someone died. but then the cemetery kind of being that lasting impression going forward. Is that kind of how you see it as well, or is it kind of, I guess maybe a better way to phrase the question is, what kind of role did this play in someone's life, especially in the past? Like, was this as equally important in a part of a life cycle as it is today?
I would say it was much more important in the life cycle. I collect memoirs. I look for people talking about death. And what I think it would be safe to say was death was once a very big part of everybody's life. Today we have funeral homes. We don't take children to funerals the way they used to. Decoration Day has faded out as a observance of respect. But at one time, death was unavoidable. For example, the children in the Kingston school would be let out of class when there was a funeral. Didn't mean they knew the person, but everybody attended the funeral. Now, when there was a big Presbyterian church here, for example, the children sat up in the balcony. They would look at the body. They would follow the casket to the grave. They would stay there to watch the casket be buried. All things that we don't even do ourselves as adults anymore. And yet children were exposed to it. Children were taken to sit up with the dying in an era before there were, well, hospitals, nursing homes, therapies. People sat up with their neighbors. Now, if you had children, you took them along. They would go to sleep. The adults would sit up. There are lots of reasons for sitting up with the sick. You had to give them their medicine, keep wood on the fire, be a comfort, be there so they didn't die alone, and so forth. But children were exposed to it. I have several memoirs where children were told to sit with the dead body while the adults did other things. You never leave a body unattended while it's unburied. And somebody must be present at all times, either taboo or for some very good reasons. And children would be told to sit with a dead baby, to sit with a dead relative. One was a boy who goes to where there's been a murder and they're holding an inquest and they have to go view the crime scene. And the boy is told to sit with the body. He's 12 or 13. Over and over and over again, children were exposed to it. Of course, adults were too. I talked to one man who had come to town on a Saturday, and some elderly person just fell over dead. And the adults somehow didn't want to touch him, and they made him lay the man out. And by lay him out, simply cross his arms and close his eyes. But they told him to do it, and he had to. Other examples of young people, father worked on the poor farm, and the teenage boys, if a pauper died, were told to go wash and dress the body. So not just starting with children, but all the way up, adults had very specific roles. You didn't do your laundry if your neighbor was being laid out. You went over there and helped clean the house, brought food, sat with the body, and so forth. So it was a constant. There were so many jobs to do, and burial was so labor intensive that everybody had a role. Maybe the men were building the coffin. Maybe the women were lining the coffin. In one story, I actually talked to this woman. She was pregnant, and a pregnant woman was not to be around a dead body because she might mark the baby. But they still brought the coffin to her house and told her to do the lining. She had to contribute. She still needed to do something. Everybody helped. And so it was a very big part of life.
I know that we don't have enough time to talk through every detail that would probably be relevant in this question, but are there general steps you can kind of walk us through from the point somebody died to when they were buried?
Sure. Well, first of all, there was a taboo against dying alone. So whether the people sitting up all night with the sick person, they want to wake the family. Everybody wants to be present. So the person dies, often surrounded by people. I've been told stories of children where there was no room to stand. The room was so full and the children were under the bed. You were there when the person passes. Immediately, everybody has a job to do. It could be 2 a.m. It doesn't matter. First, you get the body off of the bed, because the old beds with the rope strung back and forth, or with the tick, which is a big bag filled with hay or shucks or grass or feathers, you cannot leave a body on something where it will contort, because it will go into rigor mortis, and no one knows exactly when rigor is going to start. It depends on ambient temperature, body chemistry, cause of death, time of year. No one's really sure. No one in that community will really know. You got to get the body off the bed. So they would lay it out on a flat board, a door off of its hinges, boards, floorboards. I've even heard of trim, something flat. And then the body must be washed. you go to your grave clean. So women usually wash women, men wash men. Not always. There are stories of women washing men and men washing children and so forth. But you scrub the body, you dress it in clean clothing, preferably new clothing. But most older people had a garment they wanted to be put away in. They might not fit into it. You know, they might be too tiny or too big, but they would usually have said, now you remember that dress or that outfit. Men would probably be buried in their bibbers, but it'd be a new pair or a clean pair. There are stories of people going to the next town to a funeral home to buy a garment to lay them out in, but you put them in something clean. At the same time that the body is being prepared, and then the hands have to be folded, the eyes have to be closed. That's the whole coins on the eyes, but only until the eyes stay closed. You tie the jaw up, otherwise the mouth will gape. All of this is very disturbing to the living because they're going to take one last look at the body before the lid is put on. So the mouth needs to be closed, the eyes need to be closed, the hands might be folded around a Bible or for a child, a toy. I think a lot of family Bibles got buried with genealogy written in them because grandma always had her Bible. At the same time, somebody's building a coffin. Either they're going to town to buy one if they can, but generally the men are going to be building one, and they'll build it to length. There are stories, I think it's Otto Rayburn, Vance Randolph, talk about a coffin stick, where you cut a piece of wood to the length of the body to take to the coffin builder to know how long to make it. Some coffin builders built them in advance and kept some on hand. Some general stores kept them. Most people wanted one built to measure because it was believed that a store-bought one would fall apart faster. They were flimsy. You might, however, go to town and buy coffin hardware. They would come as called a casket set. It would be handles, decorative screws to attach the lid, possibly a plate that said, "Beloved Mother, rest in peace." These were engraved in advance. In New England, they would engrave them with the person's name and dates. But in the Ozarks, you just bought one already made. I actually have a couple examples in here. And those could be attached to the coffin. Those were a frill. The family would pay for that. Those weren't really necessary. The handles are not functional. You cannot carry a fully loaded coffin by the handles. But you see pictures of men carrying a coffin from underneath, but there'll be handles along the side. So someone's building a coffin. Women will line it with fabric. Sometimes we'll actually cover the outside with fabric because there isn't time for paint or varnish to dry. Burial was within 24 hours. If you have embalming, obviously you can go longer, and there are stories of people who didn't embalm and still waited days in hot weather, very unpleasant for the living. But generally 24 hours is the golden rule. You try and get them buried. And that's true in hot weather and in cold weather because you don't know if a storm is going to come, if the ground freezes, and because you never leave a body unattended. If a storm comes up and you cannot get them buried, somebody sits up night after night after night with that body, and you don't want to impose on the neighbors. So if you can, you get them buried, sometimes the same day they die. So coffins being built, coffins being lined, someone's going to town for the hardware if you want it. People are laying out the body, dressing it. All this is going on simultaneously. There was also a big belief that you needed to clean the room the person died in. They might have died of a heart attack, but you still scrub the bed, haul it out into the yard, scrub it with lye, and you hang the person's clothes out to air. In fact, there was even supposedly a saying in the Ozarks that old John's breeches will be hanging over the fence, meaning he's about to die. His clothes will be seen. If somebody walked down a road and saw the neighbor's clothes all hanging out over the porch railing, they might assume there had been a death. People will be bringing food to the family. People will be coming to comfort the family. And they will sit up all night, assuming the person dies midday and you bury the next day. People will sit up all night with the body. They might take it in turns, but you never leave the person alone. And there's all kinds of stories about wet claws on the face and the hands, but people sit up. They do not sleep. Children can sleep, but the adults sit up. The next day, very likely the coffin will be delivered the next day. They're very labor intensive to build. So that goes on through the night. There are stories of the sound of the hammer, people building. The coffin is delivered. The body is placed inside. The lid is attached loosely, not permanently. There will either be a ceremony in the house, in the church, or at the graveside. The body will be conveyed back of a wagon, back of a pickup truck, carried by hand. You arrive at the graveyard, and the grave will have been dug that day. Huge taboo against doing it in advance. I have collected people saying if the grave was dug in advance, the family won't use it. It's taboo. Someone else will die. If you absolutely have to dig in advance, you leave a few token shovelfuls of loose dirt in the bottom to shovel out that day. So technically, it was finished the day of the burial. There will be a graveside service. People will bring hymnals. Someone will lead a prayer, a church elder, a minister. And then the lid will be removed and everyone will file past and take a last look. And there are pictures from Kingston. A woman in town in the Depression had a camera, and she would take a series. I have 2 series, a baby's burial and an older adult's burial. And she would show every step of the process. And you see people crowding around, including small children, taking that last look. Faces contorted with grief, the woman's daughter, the family, the mother, people sobbing, men standing back, waiting their turn. Everybody takes a last look. You touch the body. That's considered okay. And then the lid is put on. And those beautiful little decorative screws, those little thumb screws they're called, or make it easy to take the lid on and off. But you don't bury the casket with just those little screws. You nail the lid down. That was one of the surprises to me when people told me that. Well, sure, you have the decorative screws if you want them, but the lid is nailed down. Again, very hard for the living to hear the blows of the hammer striking the coffin lid. And one of the pictures from Kingston actually shows the nails have been started. So there's the lid off to one side, and all the nails are sticking up, waiting to be driven home. Then the coffin is lowered down. Everyone stays until the grave is filled in, and then everybody leaves. So different from today, because now the casket sits there on the lowering device and people walk away, and only the vault delivery guy and maybe the guy with the backhoe stay to bury. Totally different. But everybody was watching the process, participating in the process, grieving along with the family. I mean, it was the whole community came together for these events.
Do you think that they were more comfortable with it because maybe it happened more frequently with less medical interventions, things like that? Or were they more comfortable with it because they grew up as part of the process? Or maybe both?
Or both.
Yeah.
There really was no taking the person away. There weren't hospitals, nursing homes. I mean, a broken hip for an old person was a death sentence. Take them home to die, basically. Everybody, I think you grow up with it. Tiny children see it, experience it, touch it, smell it, they see all the parts. And really, there was this story got given to me by somebody who was like an elderly woman told it to somebody who told to me, but there was actually diapering of the corpse, because you don't want fluids leaking out, and everybody knows what's involved and they participate. So if you start very, very young, in fact, you're as a child being told, this is what you need to know how to do, whether you have to do it or your time will come when you will have to close the mouth, the eyes, so forth. And then you actually experience it. Death is not hidden. Now, at some point, yes, hospitals, nursing homes, visiting nurses, what have you, would have taken a lot of that away. But up through World War II, I think that's really the end, because World War II, we had this massive exodus of people out of the Ozarks, going off to war and not coming back, or going off to war and not coming back to the Ozarks. They go off to California, they go off to places where they get better jobs. And that's when the undertaking profession really has taken over by World War II. People under funeral homes were selling burial insurance. So for a tiny amount every month, you are guaranteed a casket, you are guaranteed a service, the grave, and not the tombstone, but they will provide everything that your neighbors would have provided. And they pretty much had to, because that workforce is gone.
Yeah, and like to your point, reflects the changing sense of community in the rural Ozarks too. Yeah.
And Decoration Day starts to fade away too. At one point, decoration, you go back, you clean up the graves of your relatives. Brush, briars, stones tend to tip over. If you have mounded graves, which is big throughout the year, you remound them with fresh dirt, so they always look recent. You have a big picnic dinner, a communal dinner. Everybody brings their finest, whether it's a cake or fried chicken or your best food. You have speeches, you have singing, you have sermons. It's a family reunion. So you're having you're having a reunion with your family over the graves of your family. And one man put it, I know I am standing in this place where my family has stood. I mean, I almost like this continuity. Well, Decoration Day is, it's still held, but people drop off some silk flowers and leave, and they might drop the silk flowers off a day or two before. There's not that community coming together in most cemeteries.
I know a few years ago I spoke with a funeral director in Springfield who had been in the business for many years. And he even talked about the shift in kind of what you're talking about with Decoration Day with visitations, where when he started, they had multiple nights that were visitations, and that it was a thing where wherever you were, the funeral and the visitation, this is the most important thing you could be doing right now. You work commitments, nothing got in the way of you coming back. And that's not really the way that it is anymore. That, and whether that's people's view on death or the way our life is in terms of the busyness and all that, it just seems like the role of death, if you'll call it that, is viewed differently than it used to be.
Well, there was a transition. If you are in a community where it is expected you will sit up all night with a body, and now there's a funeral home in your county seat, and they say, oh, no, we'll take it from here. You don't just go from one to the other. There is a tapering off. And I've interviewed several funeral directors that said, well, in the early days, families would go sit up with the dead in the funeral home. And one of them complained that they would leave bologna wrappers, strings, and Pepsi bottles, because you eat while you sit up all night. And they didn't really like that, because also the funeral director would live above the business, so there'd be people coming and going. But I've talked to funeral homes in like 3 or 4 different counties in the Ozarks, so they've all said there was a period where the family doesn't sit up all night. The community sits up all night, and they would come to the funeral home to do that. So you have to have kind of an intermediate. But that would be a type of visitation. Well, now visitation is between this hour and this hour, and you come and you shake hands and you sign a guest book, and then visitation is now sometimes like just back to back with a funeral. And even that may be dying out. I don't know. But everything changes.
It's fascinating to see that. Well, and you mentioned, interviews and things you've done. How have you gotten most of the research that you've done? I mean, is it through were there documentations, written documentation? Is it mainly through interviews? Like, how have you kind of learned of the things that you know of?
I think I'm a treasure hunter. I love flea markets. I love thrift shops. I love looking for stuff. And so for me, research is the same way. I come through memoirs. I go to libraries. I ask people questions. I say, do you know somebody? In writing On to the Grave, numerous times people would say, well, my mother is 98 and her mind's sharp and she'll talk to you. And I would get an interview or somebody that could talk about how things used to be. And I was really fortunate. Tom Olmsted in Heber Springs, who was a 3rd generation funeral director, wrote a memoir. And when he was a little boy, his father would take him to embalm in the home. Again, part of the transition. Embalming used to be done on people's kitchen tables, and everybody watched. And then eventually it became, well, we just take him back to the funeral home. But Tom, as a little boy, his job was to help his father embalm, or to keep his father awake on long drives into the country. So his memoir talks about how things used to be and that transition, which was just a gold mine, because he let me interview him, I think, twice, but also I got a copy of his book. So there's the funeral industry itself talking about the transition period, and his grandfather to his father, to him, to his children, and so forth. So I interviewed anybody I could. I was very fortunate to have these 2 sets of funeral photos, both from Kingston. A woman named Kate Fancher, who'd been a school teacher, had like the only camera in town. And John Little, who used to have Grandpa's antique store in town, had, I think through his wife's family, a series of photos of a funeral. And that's what ended up being my book cover. Originally, he wouldn't let me see one of them. He said, well, I'll let you see the background where it showed the Presbyterian church, but he taped over the front, and I had to do some devious means to get him to turn into the picture and let me have access to it without the coffin showing, which was just the most. I did the picture up above, blown up, of the book cover.
I'll get a picture of
it later.
Yeah, that's stunning. It says
it all. The chairs, the homemade floral bouquets, people didn't go by.
Yeah.
The coffin, I think it's covered in fabric. It's got the hardware, and that's the woman's adult daughter. She looks like a child, but it's an adult daughter grieving.
Wow.
It tells a complete story.
You mentioned some things like not digging the grave completely the day of, or until the day,
The day of,
the day of, and things like, if you were pregnant, not being around. Are there other superstitions that you kind of saw being really common through different things because bad things would happen, or maybe to help with good things? I don't know if there was a positive side to any of this, but
well, I mean, I collect a lot of folklore, and Mary Parler taught a folklore class for decades at University of Arkansas, and she'd have her students go out and talk to old people and collect. She has one entire 8 volumes of what students brought back, and one whole volume is all on death, dying, superstitions and taboos, and it pretty much all agree. I mean, she'd have a lot of repetition, but it would all agree that you don't dig the grave in advance, for example. You don't leave until every last clod of dirt is in the grave. It's taboo. If you leave early before the grave is filled in, someone will die, or you will die, or your family will die. Cats. Huge superstition around cats. I don't know, that was one of my favorite discoveries. The belief was that if you leave a body alone and a cat gets in, it will chew off anything that's got cartilage, so ears and nose. And that actually goes back to England. In fact, in Charles Dickens, I think it's in Bleak House, a surgeon is leaving a deathbed and he says, "Oh, don't forget, get that cat out of here." So it was taken very seriously. And there are stories, people claim that cats actually did that. There's one of Mary Parler's students interviewed a friend's grandfather who had a Civil War story. I don't know, the dates do not line up on this, but supposedly there was a burial party, and while men dug graves for the dead soldiers, others had to fight off swarms of cats. I suspect that one a little bit, but just that this cat thing comes up over and over and over again. Don't let a cat near a body. Oh God, so many different taboos. Obviously not leaving the body alone, not digging the grave, not leaving the grave, carrying the body out feet first. The covering the mirrors and stopping the clocks, that's always been said, but I didn't really find that a lot. I find it a few times. You stop the clock the moment of death, which is easy. With a pendulum clock, you just take off the weight and the clock will stop. Covering mirrors, I got it a few times. I didn't find it universally where everybody talked about it. Scrubbing. The feather crown. The feather crown was a lovely one. So many things. I mean, chapter by chapter, as I researched the book, I would find things that I would the first time I'd run across, I go, yeah, I didn't believe it. Then I get it again. Well, maybe. And then again. And then pretty soon it was like an avalanche of yes. I actually have a feather crown, which I can show you.
Really? Oh, wow. In case we can't show it on here, can you kind of describe what it is?
Yes. A feather crown was, in the days when people plucked their own chickens and geese and would fill both either a mattress if you could, but definitely the pillow, these feathers would tend to ball up. And what would happen was that the quill end would go inward and the plume end would go outward, and almost like a spiral. And it would get bigger and bigger, and it would eventually be a solid ball of feathers, all with the plume ends facing outward. They're really very lovely. Now, the belief was if you found one, it was proof positive that the dead person who had died on that pillow was in heaven. If you didn't find one, that was pretty bad. So my favorite story, and it comes from Ozarks County, and again, I collect memoirs, so this comes out from oral history. A boy hears about this, and he says to his mother, "Well, what happened to Dad's feather crown?" And the mother says, "I was afraid to look." Meaning he was not a good person, and she was sure she wouldn't find one, and it was just too much for her. I've read stories of people who searched through the feathers and didn't find one and were devastated, only to find one later. That they took the feathers out and washed the pillowcase and then found the crown. Crowns are like holy relics. If you found one, you set it aside. Women were buried, like with their husband's crown, or there'd be a cigar box for the person's obituary and the crown. These were considered to be an angel crown, your crown in heaven. They went by different names: the heavenly crown, feather crown, angel crown, and so forth. Some of them, museum in, I think it was Little Rock, had a lot of them, and they had some kind of museum symposium, and they gave away their surplus. Shiloh Museum had so many, they gave me one.
Wow.
That's how I acquired it. I have certain holy grail items. If I were in a flea market and I found something, there's things I've been looking for.
Like what?
a Madstone.
Oh.
I want a Madstone so badly. That was the how you kept somebody from dying of rabies, and it was a calcium deposit, supposedly found in the entrails of an albino deer or just a deer, and they're porous. And if you were bitten by a rabid animal, you soaked it in milk, applied it to the bite, and it would stick and supposedly draw out the venom, the poison, or snake bites also. And then when it fell off, you put it back in the milk, it would release the poison, turn the milk green, purify itself. You stick it back on. You do this over and over till it refuses to stick, and then you're okay. Abraham Lincoln took one of his children to a Madstone. You always go to the Madstone, not the other way around. Madstones were so valuable, you don't loan them out. So you go to the Madstone, and you don't charge. If you own one, you don't charge for it. Again, superstition, folklore. There are stories of doctors paying a lot of money to buy Madstones. You're not supposed to sell them, but a doctor could get his hands on one. He would use it because this is before the Pasteur treatment was invented. And even when the Pasteur treatment was invented, there were years when people still used Madstones. The Pasteur was expensive, couldn't find a doctor to administer it, couldn't get to it, so forth. Or you did both, Madstone until you get Pasteur. There are stories of people dying horrible deaths despite a Madstone, or supposedly being saved because of the Madstone. But there was a company, Berry County, Missouri, in their museum. They have a display of the Carney family who made fake Madstones, and they guaranteed them. They were coated in red sealing wax. So they would make, and they actually have the device that they used. I've got pictures of it. They would make this little ball of kind of a stone, I think, cut it in half, and then embed it in a blob of red sealing wax. And it was called the Carney's Guaranteed Poison Extractor. They had a long name for it. There is a Carney's Madstone in the Berryville Museum. And then, of course, the Berry County Museum has several examples. If I ever found one of those, I would be so happy. I think if the one ever showed up somewhere, no one would know what it was. They'd probably throw it out.
Yeah, I've only seen one that I know of, and it's at College of the Ozarks. They have it in the museum
really?
there. But to your point, like, I mean, it was an unusual looking thing. But if it was in the wild, would somebody today know? No. Probably not, which is disappointing because there would have been so many around, in different places and
they had legends that went with them. Like one supposedly went back to England, like several hundred. It had been brought to this country, but had been in use in England for 100 or more years.
Wow!
And one's kept in people's lock boxes. And two brothers that went out west, and they cut the Madstone in half so they could each be protected. I mean, these were treated very seriously. A death from rabies is a hideous thing. And I grew up in India where rabies was, I've seen rabid animals. And I, as a child, watched a film strip of showing a child dying in the throes of final stages of rabies. So for me, rabies has always been something of interest. And the whole idea of the Madstone, and then the fake Madstone. I don't know, it's so many layers to that story. So if I ever find a Carney's, I mean, if somebody said, "Oh, here's a Madstone from our family," I'd be thrilled. But I'm looking for a Carney's Madstone with the red sealing wax for my collection, my cabinet of curiosities of very strange things.
Of the things that you have, which unfortunately the camera does not show all of them, but is there anything else in here that you would want to explain or show and tell at all that would really be relevant to our conversation now?
Ooh, I have things find me. People give me weird things. I have a beautiful box. I don't know if I should show this or not. It came out of Oklahoma. A woman said that she cleaned out her mother-in-law's house. It's everything from a baby's death. It's its christening gown, its hospital bill, doctor's bill, the little dried rose, and a picture of it in its coffin.
Wow.
And nobody in the family wanted this. And she said everybody was just, it was her mother-in-law's. It was the first child she had that she lost. I think there's like 3 or 4 doctor's bills from the 19-teens or 20s.
Wow.
I have it tied up in the same ribbon that she gave it to me.
Wow.
That would be something I'm so honored to have. I have a picture. There was a thing. Parents often didn't have pictures of their children. So when a child died, somebody might come over the camera and take a picture of it in its coffin. Well, a parent later might wish that they had a picture of their child alive and photographers could open the eyes. So they would paint on the child's eyelids, they would paint pupils and eyelashes. And I have an example of that somebody found, I think, in an antique store and bought and gave me. So the baby is dead, but it looks like it's alive. That was a thing. The photographers had advertised their skill in opening the eyes.
Wow.
That would be something that I'm really excited to own. And just odds and ends.
You mentioned the photography, in the coffin. Have you seen examples around here of the photography where you might have had someone who was deceased with living people? I'm sure there's a term for that, where, you have somebody who's dead, but then you have like a family picture
with the body.
Yes.
Oh goodness, yes. Joy Russell is the historian from Madison County, and she has the Historical Society has a huge archive. She has shared pictures with me. Pictures are given to be scanned for the museum, for the Historical Society's collection, and she has given me examples. There's a child's funeral in down, I think, around St. Paul, Arkansas, where you have, I think it's the parents or grandparents standing with the child. The coffin is propped up, the child is in it. I have another one of parents holding up their baby. Their faces are turned away, and the baby is in its coffin. They're holding it up. The father's holding it. The mother's face is turned away from the 20s. It's the only picture with their child. Now, occasionally, these postmortems show up on the tombstone. There was a practice of turning a picture into a little ceramic disc. They would transfer the picture. In Kingston, there is a photograph of a boy clearly in his casket. He's got the casket pillow behind him. He was, I think, a preteen, and supposedly it was the only picture ever taken of him.
Wow.
So his is on his tombstone, and in all of Arkansas, I've only found 9 examples of a postmortem on a tombstone.
Wow.
But it does happen, and almost always for infants. 3 are adults, one's a preteen, but the others are infants.
Well, mentioning tombstones, let's segue a little bit to cemeteries, because I know we have a whole lot to talk about here too, so much so that I don't quite know where I suggest that we start. I don't know if there are so many different things to talk about with regards to cemeteries. Do you have somewhere that you want to start?
I, in writing the book on death, wanted to write about how cemeteries are founded, and then certain types of stones that are more or less, I say, unique to the Ozarks. They're not. They were brought here by settlers from the Appalachians, from Tennessee, and they brought burial traditions with them, or picked up customs as they migrated here. So in the Ozarks, we have some really unusual things. Yes, you could find them in Alabama, Tennessee, farther back, but in the Ozarks, Missouri and Arkansas, we have grave houses, little buildings built on top of graves. They have no function. They don't hold coffins. They're not mausoleums. We have coffin crypts, stone coffins, either solid blocks of stone or created out of slabs with hexagonal coffin shaped lids. We have slot and tab, which are square boxes with holes cut in the lids, and then the tombstones socket into those holes. And we have something called a comb grave, C-O-M-B, also called a tent. 2 slabs of stone that make little pup tents. And you can go into a cemetery and find all of these. Or, the grave houses have disappeared. They've been mostly wood. They've rotted away. But you can find all of these styles intermixed. You can find tiny little pup tents over children's graves. Holmes Cemetery outside of Harrison has a really interesting collection of the little tents, the boxes, the coffins, plus some really interesting symbolism. Slot and tab, combs, coffins, combs on top of empty boxes, and then a little row of coffin-shaped lids. So in one cemetery, all of these different styles. I've collected lots of either obituaries or accounts of grave houses. I go to the cemetery, the houses are gone, but I can at least document that across the Ozarks, these little houses were once very, very common. In fact, I even have a picture. No one knows what cemetery it came out of, but it shows 3 or maybe 4 different houses, and they're all different styles. Little picket fence, little garden, like little garden gazebos, little really crude structures, all intermixed in one cemetery.
What was the symbolism behind these different, especially like the grave houses and the crypts, the mock crypts that were above ground?
Simply, honestly, nobody seems to know. When it comes to the grave houses, there's enough anecdotal evidence that people like dying would request them. And sometimes the person will say, so the rain doesn't fall on my face, or to keep my grave dry. But you cannot, back to, you don't dig a grave in advance, you don't carve a tombstone in advance, and you don't build a grave house in advance. Nothing can be done until the person is dead. So all of these things that are found on graves would have been made maybe a year later. So when you get somebody saying, oh, that big stone on a grave is a wolf stone to keep the wolves from digging up the body, that's utter nonsense. One, the lids are nailed down, so unless the wolf's got a crowbar, it's not going to get in. And then two, all those, now I'm not saying that when there's a fresh grave, you don't pile a lot of maybe rocks on top to protect it in the moment. But really, those structures were so labor intensive that it may be more than a year. There are cemeteries where you have matching rows of big stone crypts, probably all made at the same time. I know of two. One is a stone pen and one is a big coffin that are dated, and they're dated 1 year after the death. The person who made them basically signed their work and put a date on it. So those took so much work that no, the person died. And also you want the grave to settle. You put something solid on a grave that is, as the coffin, no embalming and no crypt, no vault. As that grave settles, it's going to drop, and you need to top fill it with more soil. Then you can build something heavy on top of it. So all these things came along a little bit after the burial. Not immediately, I mean, within a year or so, I'd say. But really there is, I mean, I don't know, there may be some sort of literature for Ozarkians, states of origin that would say why these shapes were made. I think the coffins are a memento mori. If you walk into a graveyard and you see coffins of all lengths, you're reminded to live because you too will die. You live, have your affairs in order. If you're religious, get saved. Don't take chances. Whatever it is, it's a reminder of death, and that was something people took very seriously. Living as though you too will die.
I obviously have visited a very small fraction of cemeteries compared to you, but even in the ones I've seen, there's a spectrum of the style of stones in terms of quality. And like, from what your perspective, especially late 1800s, early 1900s, was this something that people were willing to figure out a way to pay for generally, or do you see a lot of homemade stones in places where maybe resources were more limited?
First of all, there were not professional carvers until well after the Civil War. A wealthy family could send away to St. Louis. The Roseboro family, the Roseboro sons, must have sent hundreds of thousands of tombstones throughout the Ozarks. So the white marble, mostly tablets, and they signed their name so you can find them. At least in Arkansas, the first carvers, professional carvers, don't show up here till about the 1870s. There must have been a few people that would do a stone. Most, if you're a stonemason, you're making your money doing building blocks and chimney arches and so forth. I do track carvers, the ones who signed their work, or even the ones who don't but have distinctive lettering styles. I look for their work. I try to figure out where they moved around, because a tombstone carver could not make a living staying in one place. So let's say you have numerous deaths. Okay, here's a good example. Outside of Parthenon, Arkansas, there is a cemetery called Buffalo. It's absolutely beautiful. And there's a long row of stones, all made by the same carver. Some of them have death dates that, like one is 1846. That carver was born in 1846. So he is coming into a community. They have not marked those graves or marked them with field stones. They now have enough money saved up. He was probably there around 1880, let's say, give or take. He comes into the area. He stays long enough to carve up a backlog of orders, and then he moves on. So you can see all of his work. He used a certain lettering style and symbols. His work changed over time. You can tell this is early work. He is quarrying his stone locally. He's training a few apprentices in exchange for room and board, because it's very hard work. He's putting up all those stones at once, and then he moves on. And he moves over to Yellville, and he moves to Berryville, and he's actually, I find his work in southern Missouri, because he ends up committing suicide in Berryville in 1898, in his 50s, worn out and an alcoholic and a single man who just could not go on. But he goes all over the Ozarks. He just crisscrosses. And he's in one place for a while, and he again trains other men who then go on and train other men and keep going. But he's like one of my earliest examples of a professional carver, and he starts out probably coming into Fayetteville. And quickly goes to Madison County to Hinesville, over to Bentonville, and so like just crisscrossing the Ozarks. But as he trains people, then they go on, and then they have to fan out. They can't stay in one place. So until the really big, the fad for granite and the need for big equipment, laser, big saws, and the big monuments come in, 1900s. And mail order starts. Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward will ship you a marker. And all of that changes the industry. So in the early graveyards, you're getting homemade markers. If somebody could chisel something, chip something out, you're getting distinctive stones where they can remember who's where. And you're getting these structures. So if you have people that can shape stone and can make the coffins, the crypts, the boxes, the little tents, you're getting those customs that people bring with them. But all of those are labor intensive, and they pretty much end around the Civil War. Okay. A lot of them aren't even dated. They didn't letter them, but they built them.
So it's more about what they create versus the design on a stone.
Yeah, symbolism doesn't even come in until later. Well, the early markers do not have the symbols that you get a little bit later.
Well, that was my next question, was in terms of the symbolism, what are some trends that you've seen? I know that obviously fraternities and different groups like that have their own symbolism on stones. What other things have you seen as kind of trends over time?
Well, I'm a member of the Association for Gravestone Studies, and if you read their literature or you go to conferences and you see what's written about New England, the New England slates going back to late 1600s into the 1700s use a completely different symbolism. You'll have Father Time snuffing a candle. You'll see, the wing, the deaths. These things change too, but you have skeletons. There's a very skeleton holding a moon and a sun. You have bats on some of them. You have portraits. You have the New England symbolism does not make it to Arkansas. It's very specific. But as people move across the country, I guess it'd be from east to west, as you look at the from east to west, these things are changing. So the winged skulls and the winged angels, the death's heads, don't make it here. The hourglasses don't make it. I found a couple, but they that just doesn't arrive here. What people were using in the 1800s were lambs, doves, pointing fingers, clasping hands, maybe some wreaths, just sort of basic. A dove is either the soul in flight or it's taking the soul to heaven. Lambs, lots of them for children, but really it's a Christian symbol. Jesus is the shepherd, we are the flock. So lambs are appropriate for adults. Pointing fingers, pointing towards heaven. Clasping hands is the farewell between the living and the dead, not a matrimonial symbol, some people believe. And then when you get the mail order companies coming in, people still want the old symbols. So they're kind of transitioning again. The big one that becomes very popular throughout the Ozarks in the early 1900s are the gates ajar, the heavenly gates. And everyone thinks, oh, the heavenly gates, how obvious. And it's not. It was a Civil War symbol invented by a novelist right after the Civil War to help. People were grieving these tremendous losses. And she wrote a novel called The Gates Ajar, Elizabeth Stewart Phelps Ward. And the premise is that our loved ones, yes, they go to heaven, but the gates do not close behind them. And they can pass back and forth. They love us and they want to stay with us. And they want to know how we are. And we can always keep them close. They don't leave us. And with everyone suffering massive losses in the Civil War, this was tremendously comforting. So the gates ajar start popping up everywhere. Public gardens created floral, plantings of gates ajar. Men's watch fobs, women's hats. I mean, they put on everything. And so Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward started selling gates ajar on their tombstones. Arkansas carvers, I think, had those catalogs, and they started copying the gates ajar. We don't really get those until about the early 1900s. But people didn't want to give up their old symbols either, so they put the old symbol above the gates.
Oh.
You can find a lamb floating over the gates ajar. I mean, a dove makes perfect sense. Clasping hands, and then the fraternal lodges come along, not just the Masons and the Oddfellows, but you get Woodsmen of the World and they went by their initials a lot, but they had all kinds of symbols that showed you were a member in good standing. So you get a shield and an anchor floating over the gates ajar. Every lodge has put its symbol on a gates ajar marker somewhere. So then that's a transition. And then eventually the lodges die out during the Depression. People don't have money for their dues. It pretty much winds down to just Masons and Oddfellows and Knights of Pythias. Black lodges were hugely popular. They almost entirely died out during the Depression again because people didn't have money. But their emblems go on the tombstones too. So you get very, very specific lodge emblems on stones up to a point, and then after the Depression, all that ends. So everything is in transition.
You know, before we started this interview, you kind of mentioned differences you've seen racially between Black and white cemeteries. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know, you know, coming from Missouri, obviously we have Black cemeteries there as well, but I think it's similar in the sense that they're not as recognized perhaps by the wider historical context. I think that's important to talk about. And I know that you're the person who probably has seen this more than anybody else. And the similarities are probably there between Missouri and Arkansas. So what have you seen about that?
Well, first of all, I don't know of very many Black cemeteries in the Ozarks. I mean, there are some, but in the course of researching a book on Arkansas cemeteries, I've gone all over the state, and I seek out Black cemeteries. I find them absolutely fascinating and beautiful, but there are huge differences. First of all, I think due to systemic racism, Blacks are almost always relegated to the worst land. So the land that will flood and be swampy, steep, unimproved, low. Whites always want to bury on high ground, especially in the Ozarks. If you're trying to find a graveyard and you're a little bit lost, look for a highest possible ground. Chances are it's going to be up the view, the breeze, whatever. Black cemeteries, Blacks were given the worst land. And when you have a white and a Black cemetery side by side, there will be a chain link fence down the middle, and there will not be a gate in between them. They'll have separate entrances, separate roads, and the white side will be well funded and improved and mowed and maintained. And the Black side, for whatever reason, if it's a town cemetery, the Black side will not have the funding. And in Little Rock, Oakland and Fraternal, they were separate, now they're combined. Fraternal was the Black cemetery, got its land whittled away by the city over and over again, while being expected to bury paupers and indigents for free. And all the money that came in from leases and various things all went to the white cemetery. So on. So, that was up through the 50s, 60s, I guess. The Black side became so overrun that it was used to film a movie, a B movie, when they needed a place to set a scene of an overgrown area, or maybe it was a cemetery. But my point is, Black cemeteries, one difference would be upkeep. I have read on interviews where I've been told that in Black cemeteries, families were responsible for maintaining their own graves, either because there was no money for upkeep or out of custom, families maintained their own. Well, if they moved away, then those graves don't get maintained. Another difference would be that fraternal lodge emblems. I find a lot of them in white cemeteries, but nowhere as many as in Black cemeteries. And because many lodges provided a tombstone for their members, and that was important. If you can't get your grave marked, joining a lodge, knowing they'll help you in a time of trouble and will help you get a tombstone, would be a huge reason to stay a member. I have seen Black headstones with multiple lodge emblems, less common in white cemeteries. And the Black emblems are very distinctive. The Mosaic Templars, it's a snake biting its own tail, which is a symbol of eternity, crossed shepherd's crooks, and Mosaic MTA, Mosaic Templars of America. There were Black Masons, Black Oddfellows, and Black Knights of Pythias, and they used the same symbols. The women did not, the men did. But then there were at least a dozen other, maybe more than a dozen other Black lodges that were very popular and had very distinctive logos, and those show up on their members' stones.
Wow. I mean, and I'm thinking too, hearing you talk about this, I should have specified when we started talking about even burial customs. It's kind of a generalization to say that everybody in the Ozarks did things in this particular way. I mean, from what your research shows, from like in an African American community, did they follow similar types of traditions with burials? Do we have that information? Do we know?
I interviewed a black funeral director in Fort Smith,
Mm,
and he did talk to me about differences.
mm,
He said, first of all, in black communities, you do not bury in 24 hours. You
mm,
bury in as much as a week. Now, this is with embalming. But he said, if I were to hold a funeral even today and the person was buried in a day or two after
mm-hmm,
their death, I would be asked what the rush was.
mm,
You want to give family time to come back,
mm,
and a week is about the norm.
mm,
And he also talked about, now this is an earlier era, but when he was like maybe a middle-aged man, but he got started as a funeral director fairly young. He said in his earlier career, colored caskets.
mm,
There used to be a casket factory in I think it was in Fort Smith, and they would make green and red. I think green and red were the two colors that were very popular.
mm,
Now, in white communities, they I have heard of children's caskets being pink or blue,
mm,
but he talked about adult caskets being red. I think red and green were two darker colors, brighter colors, I should say.
mm,
Whereas with the pink and blue, they were pastels and maybe even checked. So there were
mm,
differences in that. But those are the two the length of time between death and burial and the color of the caskets
mm.
would be two differences that he talked about.
Okay.
But there's not a lot of information that
Mm,
I can find.
yeah. Talking about wider differences too, I know your research has been primarily focused on Arkansas, but from what you know of Missouri, are these things generally pretty similar?
Yes. Well, I love Missouri cemeteries.
Mm,
Ozarks. I love St. Louis.
mm.
That's like Disneyland.
Yeah.
St. Louis cemeteries. But no, I try to remember how many. I keep a log of how many different cemeteries in Arkansas. I've never done a count for Missouri,
Mm-hmm,
but as much as possible, I do Southern Missouri Cemetery. I go
mm,
to Southern Missouri cemeteries, take a lot of pictures, and yes, I'd say very comparable.
mm,
Occasionally, I found something uh, up near Knoll.
mm,
I think it's Knoll Cemetery. There's a marker that looks like a trunk, the
mm.
round top trunk, husband and wife.
Uh-huh.
Never seen that anywhere ever
Wow.
before, but but the symbolism is the same. The verses are the same.
Mm,
The epitaphs on the stones are the same. The style of markers. I have found the comb graves,
mm,
obviously in Missouri. I have read about. I don't think I've ever seen a Missouri grave house. I have read about them.
mm,
Old Ozark Mountaineers, the Ozarks Mountaineer. Some issues going way back.
mm,
Had some things on grave houses. There was also a little shape. I call them torso stones. The correct name is necked discoids, and they look
mm,
like little people. It's a flat marker that's
mm,
cut out like head, neck, and shoulders.
mm,
And it almost from a distance looks like somebody sitting up in their grave. They're a
mm,
little eerie. And they definitely exist in Missouri and in Arkansas.
mm,
There was also pre-Civil War,
mm,
studied by an Illinois archaeologist. But I find them in all different shapes, and like the heads are not always round
mm.
either. I find them all over the Arkansas Ozarks, and I definitely know about them in the Missouri Ozarks.
Okay.
Coffin shapes, combs, and so forth. So yes, I would say very, very comparable.
Okay. Well, and another thing, kind of talking about tombstones specifically, uh, can you speak to the rewriting the narrative that the tombstones can offer? It just almost maybe even a disclaimer if that's helpful for someone watching this. Like, don't take everything as literal. Maybe when you're in a cemetery, sometimes.
Take nothing for fact. Nothing. I do a lot of public speaking on graves and graveyards, and I have a talk called "Lies a Tombstone Told Me." And I gave it for the first time this year, and I had so much fun putting it together because we use the expression carved in stone to mean absolute. Let's have lunch next Thursday. It's carved in stone, or it's not carved in stone. Don't hold me to it. But carved in stone means nothing when it comes to a tombstone. A tombstone carver is not going to ask for proof. You can say anything you want. There is an egregious example. I shouldn't even say where this is. I'm going to hurt somebody's feelings, but where it says that this man is the man for whom the county is named. And I didn't spend much time researching him to discover that he didn't even come to Arkansas until the 1850s, let alone the county was in existence. And you can actually somehow see how and lies may be too strong a term, but you can actually sometimes trace how something ends up carved in stone that's wrong, and you can see where they started. And originally it's just a guess, and then it becomes more of a fact, and then it becomes absolute, and then it's carved in stone. I look for markers that try to rehabilitate someone's character. So the person does something the family is not proud of, and they cover the person's marker in what a great person they were. A loyal son, a good man. I only know it for men. I'm sorry, I don't know a single woman who's gotten her character rehabilitated on a tombstone. These are all men. There's one stone for two brothers. It says maliciously murdered. This is over near Boonville. Well, they were killed. It wasn't a malicious murder. Now the family, and they have two Bible verses that both have the word persecute in them. Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, or whatever. Well, what the story there was, these two white men were friends with two white men who got into a spat with two black men. And the whites decided to make their legal troubles go away by simply killing, I think either father and son or two black brothers. They borrow their friends' guns to do it, and they lie in wait for them. Well, the two men who loan their guns linger in town as long as they can, and then either they get their guns back, or probably because they want to see the dead bodies, they get on their horses and they ride home. Well, the black men have maybe been tipped off. Maybe they just got lucky and they went home a different way. So the two friends lying in wait mistake the brothers and shoot them. Shoot one, kill him on the spot. The other one is shot, and blood loss causes him to fall off his horse, and he's dragged the rest of the way. They both die. The two shooters, were eventually jailed, escape from jail, and disappear. One comes back and is eventually acquitted, despite having confessed. So the two brothers who were maliciously murdered were killed with their own guns, knowingly having given those guns to their friends, knowing exactly what the guns were going to be used for. So there's an example of tombstone that's not trustworthy. My favorite example is in Eureka Springs, and that is John Pointer. John Pointer was in trouble from the time he was a child. According to one newspaper article, he once tied up and tried to set a schoolmate on fire. His father consistently tried to get his son out of trouble, would pay his way out. And at some point, John went up into Missouri to steal horses. And that was a hangable offense. You could be killed for that. And he comes back to Eureka Springs, and his father gets his son out of town, right? Because the law is right behind him. And he pays two men to take John to Texas to pick cotton, gets him out of the state. They go off to Texas, they pick cotton. The two men decide to come back to Arkansas, and they leave. John has left the cotton patch and gotten into more trouble. I don't know what it was, but he's gone away. He comes back and his friends are gone. He goes after them on foot, catches up with them, and murders them both in cold blood. On Christmas Day, a man is out hunting. He finds two bodies. Their heads have been stove in from the back. A bloody axe is hidden in a tree, and the men's possessions are set on fire. One man was a cripple, so his crutch is burning up in that fire. John was found in the next town wearing one of the dead man's pants, carrying his pocket watch, having just sold their team and wagon. The team and wagon that they used all their cotton money to buy, so he's there under an assumed name. Judge Parker sentenced him to die, and once again, John's father had paid a good lawyer, fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they agreed with Parker, and John was hanged. His father brought his son's body back to Eureka Springs, buried him there under a stone that says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends."
Wow.
Because John claimed to the end that the two men were trying to kill each other, and he intervened and tried to keep them from killing each other, but oops, killed them by accident. So John's stone is another example of a lie that I think has maybe entered a lie. That's a little strong. John's stone is always part of a silent city that they put on in Eureka Springs, and they have people, actors say, "Here's who I was in life." Well, John's stone is a broken obelisk, so the obelisk rises and is broken at a slant. They will tell people in Eureka that his stone was smashed by angry townspeople because they hated John so much. Now, knowing what John did, I would like to have smashed his marker too, but the broken obelisk is simply a symbol of a life cut short by death. Tiny children can have broken obelisks. John's life was cut short by a noose. But in fact, it's a perfectly appropriate symbol of death. A few yards away from John is a 18-year-old boy who's also got a broken obelisk. And also in Eureka, there's a flat tablet with a carving of a broken obelisk. So this is simply, it's now an elderly man told Otto Rayburn the story of the townspeople smashing John Pointer's obelisk. And that has now entered, the cemetery history. And for all I know, maybe it was, except that you can feel the top of it and it's been carved to look like a broken obelisk. But in any event, John Stone, with that "Greater love hath no man," is just so rich. And I just, there's so many stones like that. The character rehabilitation tombstone.
Obviously, and I'm going to say we'll wrap this up shortly because I'm sure, even though we could keep going for hours and hours and hours, but kind of, why, from your perspective, obviously you've written one book, you're getting ready to finish a second book on this. Why do you think that it's important that we understand this part of our heritage and our culture? And I guess the part two of that question is, from my perspective, I wander around a lot. I get the sense that maybe cemeteries are going to be something of the past eventually.
Yeah.
And does that make you sad? Do you think that we're losing something by not maybe having them as much in the forefront as they once were?
I think we have a mutual friend who gets incensed over the fact that he does research on somebody and he can't find where they're buried because they were cremated and scattered. He says everybody should have a marker somewhere. I don't really take that approach. I plan to be cremated. I couldn't choose a cemetery. I love so many of them. I do think as cremation rises and certainly scattering becomes the norm, or columbariums, that we are going to lose the concept of the cemetery. And as cities grow around cemeteries and they need the land, things have a way of, everything changes. I don't think it makes me sad. It makes me grateful for the people that made the markers that they did. Sometimes I wonder at the money spent or the outrageousness of certain things. But honestly, I love the whole, I should say the concept. I love cemeteries, obviously. It's my happy place. Periodically, I just reach a point where I have to take a picnic lunch, take a sandwich and go find a few cemeteries and take pictures because that makes me happy. Ultimately, death is the big mystery and the big thing we are all going to face. I can live a long and happy life if I never see a single sporting event or even go to a movie. I love movies, or watch a TV show. It doesn't ultimately matter. Someday I'm going to have to I'm going to find out what happens. We're all going to find out what happens when we die. So wandering in a cemetery and seeing somebody with my birth date and looking to see when they die, or reading a poem about how people console themselves or come to terms with death, whether it's God needed our child or God only takes the best, which I find odd that it's consoling, but it is to people. But when you walk through a cemetery and you see how different eras have memorialized the dead, come to terms with death, or questioned what happens, or how we choose the things to leave behind to remember a person. For the most part, the dead don't get to say how they're remembered unless they put up a stone pre-need. The family determines. And whether it's guarded language, we will remember how you lived, not how you died, kind of a sentiment. It is the big mystery. It is the thing we're all going to face. I think it's healthy to be aware. I don't mean obsess about it, but to be aware of it. And I also think that although it's sad, it's also a very beautiful thing. And cemeteries reflect that.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we didn't cover?
so much ground. I guess just one thing, and that is when I started out systematically going to graveyards and really spending time, I would walk in the gate, and you can always tell the old side from the new side. And I would go over to the old side, and I'd look at the new markers and think, who's got that kind of time? Who cares? See these big granite slabs, didn't care. Go over and read antique marble. But more and more I've discovered that if you want to laugh, if you want something funny, deliberately funny, go to the new side. Because we now spit in the eye of the Grim Reaper. We make jokes about death. I have seen pictures of the deceased with a T-shirt that says, "Life is short, make fun of it," for a kid whose life was short. Somebody putting bunny ears over their father's head, and that picture's on the stone. I have seen a blonde joke on a tombstone, Bentonville City Cemetery. I have seen things that people leave. I have seen people's tattoos lasered onto their stones. I have seen people's possessions, who they were in life, but sometimes unintentionally. I have seen naughty words on tombstones. I have seen, can I say this on your program? I have seen the word bullshit on a man's stone. And there's a story behind it. And I was lucky that somebody told me the story. This was Paul Klipsch, the one who had the Klipsch, has a factory and had a lot of patents. And the workers in his factory said it all the time. He said it all the time. It was like the company joke. And when he died, he had given out little buttons that said bullshit, and everybody wore them to his funeral. I mean, covertly, not, but it was like an in joke.
Wow.
His tombstone has a little carving, a little circle with the word bullshit. I have seen the word asshole on a man's tombstone. Yeah, he put it there himself.
Wow.
I have seen a man's stone that said hated and feared by most. He's still alive, so he chose those words. I have seen oh my gosh, there's one that says follow me on Facebook. Man's still alive. I've tried to follow him on Facebook. I can't find him. But he chose his own pictures of himself, and he has two jokes. One that says, sucks to be me, I'm dead, although he's not yet. And the other side says, I made many deals in my life, but I sure went in the hole on this one.
Wow.
Not the only first time I've seen that joke. I've seen that another time, or a time or two. So go to the new side and always check the backs of the stones. There's a very ordinary looking stone, Arkansas graveyard, I can't think where it is. Walk around the back and it says, gone to Walmart. So the humor is often hidden, but it's out there.
Wow.
And it's on the new stones. And there's so much of it. And it's just a delight, because especially if you've been spending your morning reading the stones of children who in this day and age would not have died because of vaccines and therapies and interventions, and you read or you see all the flu epidemics or war deaths, and it does get sad. It is sad. And then you walk over to the new side and you get a belly laugh from somebody who deliberately wanted you to be entertained. That's a lovely thing.
That is, if we can end on a happy note on an interview around death and dying, that sounds like a good place.
I like to joke that I study death in a positive, life-affirming way. So.
Well, thank you so much for visiting. I really, really appreciate it.
Caitlin, thank you for giving me this opportunity.